Hello and welcome to lesson 2 of week 22. In this lesson, we are going to look at how to build a basic login register system and how we are going to connect Flask with MySQL database. My name is Mildred. In the last lesson, we started by creating a base file that we can include on other files so that all common files will be in the base, and then we use inheritance to include them. In the base file, we created different blocks, and the different blocks are placeholders where the child templates will modify what we have within the block. So I have modified this to use the URL for. One of the reasons we use URL for is to have dynamic URL, and I'm going to explain in a bit why I changed the value of the href attribute. So this should be the way you write your values going forward. This is the best way, and I will explain why shortly. So for the URL for, the expression written here is in the static folder, and the file name is style.css. I'm using Bootstrap. We are not required to understand cascading style sheet for this course, so you can just copy and paste the code, but I'm going to be using Bootstrap for some quick and dirty styling, but we are not going to go into cascading style sheet. I'll also leave links to extra readings and extra videos from front-end course if you want to follow along in building your forms and understanding the basic HTML and CSS structure. Before this class, to make it fast, I've created a login template and a register template, and then I have changed the app to be the app.py file, because by convention we don't have index.py. You find people using app.py, and that is what we are going to use going forward. So we are gradually transitioning into doing things professionally, but what we are going to discuss in this lesson today is not the professional method, but the easy basic method to get you started, to make you to understand what we are going to do, why we do what we do, and then we're going to add security validation and everything that makes it production ready as we go along. The first thing we want to do is to activate your environment, and always remember this is for mac.venv means /activate. For Windows, refer to your week 20 resource to see the command to use to activate your environment. Once activated, we want to install MySQL client. So for Windows, you do pip install MySQL client, and then after installing MySQL client successfully, you want to install Flask MySQL DB like this. For Mac, before installing MySQL client and Flask MySQL DB, you want to first of all brew install MySQL and package config like this. So the commands are in your resource for this week, and so you can go to your course resource for week 22 to find the commands for Mac and for Windows. If you have more errors, you'll find how to troubleshoot that on your resource, or post it in the class channel and somebody will get to you on your errors. Recall in part 1 we looked at MySQL. We use MySQL Workbench. We want to create a database and also create a table that we're going to use for this lesson. And so you fire up MySQL Workbench and you establish a connection. You log in with your password if you still remember it, and then we want to create a new database. I'll just make this fast. I want to create a database called users. I want my character size to be UTF-8 MP4, and I want the collection to be Unicode CI, and then I will apply. So you can just write SQL query to get this done. And so it's successfully created, and we should see it as part of our schemas in the list of schemas I'll close. So we have users here. Now that we have this, we want to run a query, and the query we want to run is to create a registrations table. So we'll first of all use users, and then we want to create table registrations, and in this table we want to have an ID column that auto increments when we want it to be a primary key, and we also want it to be an integer. We want to have another column called username, and we want this to be a variable character, and let's say we want it to be 255, and we don't want it to be null. We want another one called password. I'll put user pass as a column name, and let's say virtual 100, and then we also want it to be not null. So let's leave it at the basics, because we're still going to delete this and do it properly later on. So once this is done, I will run, and then this is created. And when I refresh this, I look at the tables. I have my registration table, I have my column, so I have my username column and my user pass column to store my password. So we talked about the URL for method, and why I use this is we're going to see a lot of it right now, and we're going to be using it to build dynamic URL. And why it is particularly useful is where we need to restructure URL based on user data. And it also has other uses that are nice, like allowing or handling escaping of characters better, or allow us to modify routes. And the paths, when we define the paths, they're always absolute paths, so that is the advantage. So let's go to the index page, or let's go to the login page first, and let's create a login form. To make this faster, I am going to copy and paste the login form that I have created previously, and you'll find the code in your resource. And what I want to do with this form is to inherit from the template file and also have a form that the user can log in when they already have an account created. So I'm going to paste some code here. So for this login form, the area of interest is the content area. All of this inheritance here we discussed in last lesson, and we inherited from the base file. We change the title to be login to replace what is on the parent file, and then we just call the head block, and we use super to inherit all of the meta tags and the link from the head section, or everything that we define in the head from the parent. And then the content area is where we want to create the form. Now ignore all of these div tags and all of this HTML and CSS styles apply to it, and the most important part here is the form. So what we do now for the form, so if you're a front-end developer and you are coming to learn backend, you will understand this better than those who are just backend. What you want to do is that the action will now have URL for login. The method is post. Now we use this method for the route also, and we're going to look at that shortly. We created the div tag that will just hold a message that will be displayed when a user logs in or fails to log in with the correct credentials, and then we use the label and the input field. Now what you need to take note of here is the form action and the method, and also what we have as the name for each of the input field. You also saw this in JavaScript, where that's for those who did front end course, where we refer to the name or the ID to get input that the user has entered. And so now we use the name, username, and the name here, password. So we have the login form created. Let's also create the registration form, which will be the same thing. We just want the user to create a registration form or to create an account with the username and the password. So I'm going to paste some code there also. So for the registration form, we are not validating, but we're going to do some basic registration where we have a username field. We confirm the username, password, confirm password. But this lesson is not going to validate if it's confirmed to be correct or not. We can use JavaScript later on to do that confirmation or all of those validation. Those are front end work, but we're also going to do the back end confirmation of matching them to see that they must be correct. But mostly we do these things on the front end. And so we're not doing any confirmation here. All we're interested in is creating it, making sure that the username does not already exist in the database, and then somebody can successfully create an account and send it to store in MySQL database using the username and the password. So we have those fields created here. Everything above is same as the index page, inheriting from the base template and filling in with the variables we want the child template to have. So for this one, it's not going to be login, but it will be register. So we have the login page, the registration page. Let's do an index page that is going to have the name of the user when the user successfully logs in, like the session is started. It's going to have the username. So on the index file, I have just a little bit of code that will just say URL for logout. We want the logout to be on the index, but this is not the structure. I just want somewhere where we can create routes or functions for login, for registration, and for logout, and we want somewhere to be able to practice this, and we want somewhere to show us that when somebody logs in successfully, redirects to the index page and show the session that has started or the username of the person who is logged in. So I have created all of these template files, all inheriting from the base. It's time for us to now work on the app where we need all of our views displayed, or where we give all of the commands. For us to start using MySQL, we need to first of all connect the Flask application to the database. Then we want to configure the cursor, and then we are going to create the functions that we want to run on login and on registration. So as always, the first thing we want to do is to import Flask from Flask. So we'll say from Flask, import Flask. We also import render templates. We also import URL for. We want to import session also. Now, why do we import all of this? We saw in last week's lesson what we use render templates for. We want to use it to render the template, actually, the view that we want the user to see. We use request, and request is when we are doing post or get request. We use the request, or it's like the object that contains all the data that is sent from from the client to the server, and it is recovered using get and post method. We have the redirects that we are going to use to send the user to a particular URL with the status code, or just redirect to a URL when something succeeds or fails, or based on commands that we give it. And the URL form is the method we use for us to build dynamic URL. And session, we are going to use it to make sure that data persists across pages for a logged in user. So these are the basic imports that we need for here. So we also want to say from Flask MySQL DB, we want to import MySQL. We also want to import the cursor, and we have said the cursor is something that we need because Flask cannot interact with database tables until we have something we call a cursor. And this cursor provides the means for us to be able to execute SQL queries because it helps to scan the database for data. So let's say we want to do some regular expression. Let's say we want the username to contain only letter or numbers. We import RE. There are many other things we can do. We stop here for basics. So app is equal to Flask name, refer to week 20 if you don't know why we do this. So app.secret. These are all things that you always do every time you create a web app or a system. So let's say the secret is, I'll just give it any secret. Normally your secret will be secured. We are going to explain this when we are getting production ready, why we do what we do. So now we want to do the configuration for MySQL. MySQL.config, we want to get the host. The host is usually localhost. If you have another host name that is not localhost, when we look at MySQL administration, you understand this better. The host is usually most of the time localhost. We want app.config, and we also want to configure the user, and the user we have is always the user root, or that's the what we configured as root. We don't have another user yet. We also want to put the password. So your MySQL Workbench password is what you're going to put here. So this is password. Now take note that when we use CI/CD or we do version control, we send this to GitHub. We always don't want to send our configuration file. So maybe we'll have a settings file where we have all of these values and we never have to send them out. But this is just for learning purpose. But professionally, you won't use a file like this with all of these values. You want a settings file and want to get them from different environment files, or from your environment file that will be kept. So we have that, and we want to say what database are we going to be using. So say app.config. The database that we have configured is called users, and then now I want to say MySQL, and I want to store it in the variable, so we can always use this is equal to MySQL app. So this we have successfully connected to MySQL. The next thing I want to do now is to define the route. The index route, I'm not going to create a function for this. I'm just going to create the route for login and for register. So app.route login, I'm going to use one function that will check if it is a get method. That is, if we're just requesting the login form, display the login form. And if it is post, which means that if we are submitting the login form that we have filled values in, we should process it. So when we have this, we want it to be the login, and we want to have a variable called message, so we can have the message displayed dynamically based on whatever error that we encounter. So we want to check again if request. So recall that we use request library here. We want to say if the request method is post. We want to also check if a username is filled in and a password is filled in. And then the next thing we want to do, we want to get that username that is filled into the form, store it in a variable called username, which is request.form username. So we're getting this from the form. So recall that I said you should take note of the name of the input field. The name of the input field for the username was username. The name of the input field for the password was password. And so we store them in a variable. Now we want to use this cursor so we can execute SQL queries. Now the name of our database that we have is registrations. Now I use Copilot, so I have this auto field, but I'm correcting it as I explain. So cursor.execute, we are going to run SQL queries. So we know how we do select statements. So we're selecting all from registrations where the username is, we're using a placeholder for the string, and then we're going to replace this with the username and password. But now we know that our calling name for password on our table is user pass, not password. So whenever you are doing queries, make sure your table name and your column names matches what you have in your database, and the name of the variables that will be the values are the values you stored in these variables when you got the data from the form. And then we want to fetch that, and what we'll do now is if we're able to fetch any data from here, that means we found a match in the database. We want to say login successful as the message, and we want to render the index page with the message. And when we render the template in the index page, it's going to show the session or the name of the user as we set it to be. But if we don't get any match from the database, we want to say incorrect username or password as the message. So this is why we set the message variable to empty string, and we want it to dynamically be filled in based on what happens as we go along. So this is how we do the login. But one thing we want to do again is for the get method. So if the request is not post, we want to just return render template login.html. And so while we return this, we're going to return this here. Okay. So this is what will render the template login.html if the request is not post. If we don't have a post request or submit, we always want the login form to display. That's what this return means. Okay. So let's do that for the logout route. So for logout, all we want to do for logout is we want to set everything to none. So let's do the logout. We want to set the login to none, ID to none, username to none, and then we want to redirect to the login page like this. Then we want also to do for the registration page. We also do it like the index page. It's just going to be, we put a variable for the message like this, and then we're going to look at the request. If it is post, we want to check if username and password. Now we are not using email for this, and so I'm going to delete email because we just use username and password to test. And then we want to say if the request is post, we want to get everything entered into the username and password field. We want to also get the cursor and then execute a statement that says we should select all where the username is this, and if we find that username already exists, we want to display a message saying that username already exists. If not, we want to check or do a regular expression match to make sure that we only have numbers and letters in the username. And if it's not, if the form is not filled in before the button is clicked, we want to send a message that says the user should fill in the form. Or if all of this doesn't happen, we want to insert into the registrations. That means if everything is okay, insert into the table the username and the password that has been entered by the user, and then we want to display a message. After this, we also want to do something else. We want to say if the request method is post and there is no values in the form, username and password are not filled, we want to say the person should fill out the form, and then we want to render the HTML or the register.html page like this. So when you go over this again, you're going to understand this is a lot to digest all at once. You just have to write out your algorithm, knowing that I want to check if the form, if the submit button was clicked, if the user entered values in the form, what are the values in the form. I want to match it against the database and see if it already exists. If it doesn't exist, I want to check or do any validation I want. I want to check if it doesn't exist, I want to insert it into it. I want to display a message. And if a user clicks on the submit button and no value in it, I want to allow the form to continue to be displayed until a value is entered for it to be posted. So this is all the logic that we have done here. Now we've written a lot of code without testing to see if they actually work. Let us start our server, and I've shown you how to start your server, but I want to show you a method where in the event you have errors and you make changes, you want it to automatically reload. And for this, we are going to change it to like this Flask app. The name of our configuration file is app.py like this, and we're going to use debug flag like this. I want to say debug run is going to start running, and when we click on this to start, we are straight on our login page like this. So this is the login page that we designed. If I try to enter any username and password, to give me an error because I don't have anything in my database, so incorrect username and password. We have need an account sign up. When we click on this, it should take us to the register page. Now we're on the register page. Let's create a username. Let's say Mildred123, and let's say password. Let's confirm this. Now the confirm username and username, we have not done any validation for that, so whether it's correct is wrong, it will still go through. For now, we just focus on the username and the password and inserting into the database and retrieving the values from the database. And so the password here now will be, let's say user123. I'll put another password, and then I'll sign up. As long as there's a username and password, I've successfully registered. When I go to my SQL workbench this time and I say select all from registrations, I should find that I have Mildred123 registered here. So we can create as many users and you have them inserted into your database. Now because we have this inserted in the database, there is no validation, there is no security. Take note that this is not how we'll do this for production. We can now come here to login. When I click sign in here, you should go back to the login page, and then I want to put Mildred123 and I want to put my password, and if it's correct, it should redirect me to the index page showing the session that I started. Hi Mildred123, welcome to the index page. And when I click logout, it should redirect me to the login page. So this is the logic that we have just created, and it's going to be difficult to understand at first. But as we go along, we're going to streamline it. We're going to re-explain it in more professional ways, and we're going to change the whole structure, but using this as a base to be able to have encrypted, secured, and production ready login register system. Thank you, and see you in the next lesson.